In October 1929, high above Lexington Avenue, a steel needle slid silently through the crown of the Chrysler building, lifted from inside its own skeleton, like a blade drawn from a hidden sheath. Workers who had bolted it together in secret for weeks watched as 185 feet of stainless steel rose into the Manhattan sky, stealing the title of tallest building on Earth in under 90 minutes. It looked effortless. It looked triumphant. But the victory had been engineered through deception, ruthless speed, and a gamble that could have killed men by the dozen. Chapter 1. A skyline addicted to height. In the late 1920s, Manhattan was gripped by a competition that treated steel like ammunition and height like a weapon. Every month brought news of another tower rising higher than the last. Architects unveiled renderings that promised to pierce the clouds. Developers boasted of record-breaking elevations before foundations were even poured. The race had no finish line, only the next rival to overtake. Height became currency. Height became power. And in a city drunk on prosperity, height became an addiction no one could resist. This was the roaring heart of the 1920s, when Wall Street profits seemed infinite, and real estate speculation turned entire neighborhoods into vertical battlegrounds. Between 1925 and 1929, the value of Manhattan real estate climbed from $8 billion to nearly $12 billion. Towers sprouted along Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, and the financial district at a pace that staggered engineers who had worked their entire lives in the trade. The city was building itself into the sky at a speed that defied gravity and common sense. Two men emerged at the center of this fever dream, or each carrying ambitions too large for the earth to contain. Walter Chrysler stood at the peak of the automobile empire that bore his name. His factories stretched across the industrial heartland. His sedans rolled off assembly lines in Detroit at rates that made competitors nervous. He had clawed his way from railroad mechanic to corporate titan through sheer force of will, and by 1928, his fortune was measured in tens of millions. But wealth alone was not enough. He wanted something permanent, something that could not be repossessed or devalued. He wanted his name carved into the skyline forever. Across the drafting tables of Manhattan, architect William Van Allen was locked in a bitter rivalry with his former partner, H. Craig Severance. They had once shared a firm. They had once shared dreams. But partnerships built on ambition have a way of fracturing under pressure, and by the late 20s, the two men were no longer speaking. They were competing. Every project became a proxy war. Every commission became a chance to humiliate the other. And when the race for the tallest building began, Van Allen saw his opportunity for vindication. The question that hung over the city was simple and terrible. Why did height matter so much? What drove men to risk fortunes and reputations on a competition with no real prize except bragging rights? The answer lived somewhere in the fevered logic of the Jazz Age, when optimism felt limitless and consequences seemed distant. Height was visibility. Height was dominance. And in a city where yesterday's champion became tomorrow's footnote, height was the only way to be remembered. But memory, as it turned out, had a price. Chapter 2. An Auto King Chases Immortality. Walter Chrysler did not just want an office tower. He wanted his name written across the clouds. By 1928, Chrysler had everything a man of his era could desire. His automobile company dominated the market behind only Ford and General Motors. His fortune grew by the day. He lived in luxury, traveled in style, and commanded respect from boardrooms to factory floors. But beneath the surface of success lived a restlessness that no amount of money could quiet. He had built an empire, yes, but empires could crumble. Markets could shift. Competitors could rise. He needed something that would outlast the headlines, being something that would stand when the cheering stopped. He found his answer in steel and stone, 77 stories high. The building would rise at the corner of Lexington Avenue and 42nd Street, a location that placed it at the crossroads of Midtown Manhattan. It would be modern in every sense, wrapped in Art Deco ornament that celebrated the speed and power of the machine age. The crown would be faced in stainless steel, a material so new that most architects had never used it on such a scale. And most importantly, it would be tall, taller than anything else in the world, 1,046 feet from sidewalk to spire tip, 67 usable floors stacked above a bustling street, nearly 4 million bricks laid by hand, bonded with mortar mixed on site and hoisted skyward, more than 20,000 tons of structural steel, each beam measured, cut, and riveted into place by crews working through winter cold and summer heat. 3,800 windows to wash, each one a portal offering views that stretched for miles. The numbers were staggering. The ambition was even larger. But Chrysler made a decision that set this project apart from every other skyscraper climbing through the Manhattan sky. He would finance the tower himself, not through shareholders, not through corporate bonds. This would be his money, his risk, his legacy. The building would belong to his children, passed down as a monument to what their father had built from nothing. It was an act of ego, certainly, but also an act of love. He believed the tower would stand for generations, a permanent proof that Walter Chrysler had existed and mattered. The choice carried consequences he could not yet imagine. Construction began in late 1928, and from the first day, the pace was relentless. Chrysler demanded speed, and he wanted the building finished before rivals could catch up. He wanted the title of tallest before anyone else could claim it. And he was willing to pay whatever it took to make that happen. Van Allen, his architect, shared the obsession. Together, they pushed contractors, engineers, and workers to move faster than the industry had ever moved before. But there was a problem they had not anticipated. Across town, another tower was climbing just as fast, and its architects believed they had already won. Chapter 3: Rivals in a Race Without Rules. Across town at 40 Wall Street, another tower was climbing, and its architects believed they had already won. The Manhattan Company building, backed by powerful financiers and designed by none other than H. Craig Severance, was rising through the financial district with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Severance had announced a final height of 927 feet, a figure carefully calculated to surpass the Woolworth Building, which had held the world record since 1913. The press covered the race with breathless excitement. Newspapers printed side-by-side comparisons of the two towers, tracking their progress floor by floor. Bets were placed, predictions were made. And for months, it appeared that Severance would claim victory. Van Allen watched from Midtown with quiet fury. He had designed the Chrysler building to reach 925 feet, just 2 feet shorter than his rival. The margin was unbearable. The humiliation would be public and permanent. His former partner would win, and the world would see Van Allen as the architect who came in second. The thought gnawed at him through sleepless nights and tension-filled meetings. He needed a solution, He needed a weapon. And so, he conceived the Spire. It would be hidden inside the building's crown, assembled in secret where no rival could see it coming. The Spire would be constructed from stainless steel, a metal that gleamed like silver and weighed far less than traditional masonry. It would rise 185 feet above the dome, pushing the total height to 1,046 feet and reclaiming the title in a single, dramatic reveal. The plan was audacious. The plan was risky. And if executed correctly, the plan would be devastating. Chrysler approved it immediately. The man who had built an automobile empire understood the power of surprise. He knew that victory often belonged not to the strongest competitor, but to the one willing to gamble when others played it safe. The order went out to contractors, engineers, and steel fabricators. Build the Spire in sections. Hoist it through the interior shaft. Assemble it where no one can see. And when the moment is right, raise it into the sky and claim the crown. But secrecy of this magnitude came with costs that no one wanted to calculate. The Spire sections were fabricated off-site and delivered in pieces small enough to pass through the building's interior. Workers hauled them up through the elevator shafts and stairwells, navigating tight corners and narrow passages. Inside the hollow crown, teams worked behind locked doors, riveting the sections together in near darkness. The work was slow. The work was dangerous. And the work had to remain invisible until the final moment. Outside, the public race continued. Newspapers updated their tallness tallies. Severance added floors to 40 Wall Street, confident that he had secured the title. The Manhattan Company building topped out in the spring of 1929, and celebrations erupted in the financial district. Champagne flowed, speeches were given. The world's tallest building, they declared, now stood at the southern tip of Manhattan. Van Allen said nothing. Chrysler said nothing. And inside the crown of their tower, the secret Spire waited like a loaded gun. The question was no longer whether they could pull off the deception. The question was whether the men assembling the Spire in silence would survive long enough to see it rise. Chapter 4. The Spire Built in the Shadows. While newspapers printed confident headlines, crews worked behind locked doors inside a hollow shaft no outsider could see. The crown of the Chrysler building was designed as a series of arched terraces, each one smaller than the last, stacking upward like a steel wedding cake wrapped in gleaming stainless steel. But at its center was a void, a vertical tunnel that ran from the 65th floor to the tip of the dome. This was where the Spire would be assembled, piece by secret piece, in a workspace that felt more like a cave than a construction site. Light came from portable lamps. Ventilation came from open gaps in the unfinished walls. And privacy came from the simple fact that no one outside the project knew the space existed. The Spire itself was an engineering marvel disguised as an architectural flourish. It consisted of 5 sections, each one tapered and bolted to the next, forming a needle that weighed approximately 27 tons. The sections were hauled up through the building's interior using the same hoists and pulleys that moved steel beams during the main construction. But once inside the crown, the work became painstakingly precise. Every rivet had to align perfectly. Every joint had to bear the stress of wind and weather. And every worker had to understand that a single mistake could send the entire structure crashing down through the floors below. The crews assigned to this task worked in rotating shifts, often through the night when the building was emptiest. Foremen handpicked men known for their skill and discretion. No one was allowed to speak about the project outside the site. Families were told vague stories about overtime on the upper floors. Friends were given excuses about why their shifts ran so late. The secrecy was absolute, enforced not by threats, but by a shared understanding that this moment would define their careers. If the Spire succeeded, they would be legends. If it failed, they would be footnotes. 220 workers were employed on the upper floors during the final months of construction, though not all of them were aware of the Spire's existence. Approximately 40 men worked directly on the hidden assembly, spread across 3 shifts operating 6 days a week. The cost of the Spire alone, including materials, labor, and engineering consultations, reached an estimated $100,000, a staggering sum in 1929. The schedule allowed for 12 weeks of assembly inside the crown before the final raising, a timeline compressed by Chrysler's insistence that the building be ready before the end of the year. Safety in 1929 construction was a concept more theoretical than practical. Harnesses were rare. Guardrails were optional. Workers balanced on beams inches wide, hundreds of feet above the street, relying on experience and luck to keep them alive. The culture accepted risk as part of the job. Men who complained were replaced. Men who hesitated were mocked, and men who fell were mourned briefly before the work resumed. The official record claims that no worker died during the construction of the Chrysler building, a statistic that seems miraculous given the pace and the danger. But official records in that era were notoriously incomplete, and injuries that did not result in immediate death were rarely documented. Inside the crown, the risks multiplied. The workspace was cramped and poorly lit. The steel sections weighed hundreds of pounds each and had to be maneuvered through tight angles. The riveting process required open flames in an enclosed space filled with sawdust and debris. And the wind, funneled through gaps in the unfinished walls, created gusts strong enough to knock a man off balance. Workers tied ropes around their waists and looped them over beams, a makeshift safety system that offered more psychological comfort than actual protection. If someone slipped, the rope might catch them, or it might snap, or it might hold just long enough for them to swing into a steel girder and shatter bones. The paranormal lore that would later attach itself to the Chrysler building often pointed to this period as the source of the hauntings. Security guards in later decades reported hearing footsteps on the upper floors when no one else was present, and maintenance workers claimed to see shadowy figures near the crown, always at the edge of vision, always gone when approached. The stories grew with each retelling, feeding on the building's reputation and the city's love of ghost tales. But the rational explanations were simpler and more grounded. The crown, with its open arches and metal surfaces, created acoustic anomalies. Sounds from the street below could echo upward and seem to originate from within, and temperature differences between the interior and exterior caused drafts that moved with surprising force, stirring dust and debris in ways that resembled movement. And light refraction through the stainless steel created optical illusions, especially at dawn and dusk when the angles were most dramatic. Whether the stories held truth or merely reflected the anxiety of men working in dangerous conditions, one fact remained. The Spire was assembled in near total secrecy, and by October 1929, it was ready to rise. The gamble had been made, the trap had been set, and the world had no idea what was coming. Chapter 5. speed as both weapon and threat. The building rose at an average of 4 floors per week, a pace that left little room for hesitation. Speed was the religion of the Chrysler Building project. Every decision, every schedule, every contract negotiated with subcontractors revolved around one imperative: move faster. And Chrysler himself had built his automobile fortune on assembly line efficiency, on the idea that time was money and delay was death. He brought that philosophy to construction, demanding that his tower climb through the Manhattan sky at a rate that made competitors nervous and engineers uneasy. And for a while, the strategy worked. The building rose with a momentum that felt unstoppable, each new floor adding height and bringing the dream closer to reality. But speed always carries a cost. And on a construction site, 700 feet above the pavement, that cost was measured in human lives. The workers who built the Chrysler Building were known as Sky Boys, a term that carried both admiration and grim inevitability. These were men who walked narrow beams without safety equipment, who riveted steel while balanced on planks that swayed in the wind, who climbed ladders bolted to the exterior of the building because the interior staircases had not yet been installed. And they were immigrants, mostly drawn from Irish, Italian, and Eastern European neighborhoods, where construction work offered one of the few paths to steady wages. They were young, mostly, because older men understood the risks too well to take them. And they were expendable, mostly, because the city had an endless supply of men willing to replace them if they fell. The pace demanded by Chrysler and enforced by his foreman left no room for caution. 4 floors per week meant that steel had to arrive on schedule, be hoisted into position immediately, and riveted in place without delay. Concrete had to be poured while still fresh. Bricks had to be laid before the mortar dried. And workers had to move from task to task with a fluidity that allowed no second guessing. Lunch breaks were short, rest periods were rare, and complaints were met with dismissal. The message was clear: keep up or get out. Documented injuries from the site were sporadic and incomplete, a reflection of the era's lax reporting standards. A riveter who lost fingers in a mishap might receive a small payout and be sent home, his name never appearing in any official record. A laborer who fell from a beam and survived with broken bones might be taken to a hospital and forgotten by the project within days. The official tally claimed 0 fatalities during construction, a number that seemed statistically improbable given the scale and speed of the work. But 0 deaths was a distinction that mattered to insurance companies and public relations departments, and so 0 deaths became the story that stuck. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Workers who survived the project later told stories of near misses and close calls that haunted them for decades. A beam that slipped from its hoist and missed a man's head by inches. A scaffold that collapsed under too much weight, sending tools and materials crashing down while the men on it clung to the steel frame. A gust of wind that caught a worker off balance and left him dangling by a rope until his crew could pull him back to safety. These stories were shared in bars and union halls, traded like currency among men who understood that luck was the only safety equipment that truly mattered. The paranormal whispers that would later attach themselves to the Chrysler Building often focused on the upper floors, where the speed of construction had been most intense and the risks most acute. Security guards reported hearing unexplained sounds, footsteps echoing through empty corridors, voices murmuring in the darkness. Some claimed to see figures moving near the crown, silhouettes that vanished when approached. The stories accumulated over decades, in feeding on the building's mystique and the city's appetite for ghost tales. But the rational explanations were always available for those willing to look. The Chrysler building, like all tall structures, was a machine for channeling wind and temperature. The crown, with its open arches and metal surfaces, created acoustic effects that could mimic human sounds. Drafts moved through the interior with surprising force, carrying dust and debris that resembled movement in low light. And the play of shadows on stainless steel, especially at dawn and dusk, created optical illusions that the human brain interpreted as figures or faces. The building was not haunted. It was simply alive in the way all great structures are alive, breathing and shifting and responding to the elements. Whether the speed of construction left scars deeper than the official record acknowledged remains an open question. The building stands. The tower rose on schedule, and the men who built it, living and dead, are remembered only in the aggregate. Their names were not carved into the cornerstone. Their faces do not appear in the promotional photographs. But their labor is embedded in every rivet, every beam, every floor that climbs toward the sky. The question that lingered then and lingers still is simple. How far can ambition push before something breaks? Chapter 6. 90 minutes that changed everything. On a cold morning in October 1929, the final sections of the spire began to move. The day had been chosen carefully. Weather reports promised clear skies and light winds, conditions crucial for lifting a 27-ton needle of steel through a narrow opening and securing it atop a building already scraping the edge of the atmosphere. The crews had rehearsed the procedure for weeks, running through every step in their minds until the sequence became automatic. The hoists had been tested and retested. The cables had been inspected for frays or weaknesses. And the world outside the construction site had no idea that anything unusual was about to happen. Inside the crown, the final preparations moved with quiet efficiency. The uppermost section of the spire, the gleaming tip that would become the building's signature, was positioned directly beneath the opening in the dome. Cables were attached, hoists were engaged, and at precisely 9:30 in the morning, the order was given to lift. The spire rose slowly at first, emerging from the building's interior like a blade being drawn from its sheath. Workers positioned on the terraces of the crown guided it upward, using hand signals to communicate with the hoist operators below. The process was agonizingly precise. Too much speed and the spire could swing out of control. Too little and the wind could catch it and create torque that would snap the cables. The margin for error was measured in inches. 90 minutes. That was how long it took to raise 185 feet of stainless steel and bolt it permanently into place. 90 minutes to transform the Chrysler building from a respectable skyscraper into the tallest structure on Earth. 90 minutes to deliver a victory that had been engineered in secret and executed with surgical precision. The crowds gathered on Lexington Avenue as word spread. Office workers leaned out of windows. Pedestrians stopped mid-stride to crane their necks upward. Cameras appeared on rooftops, and across the city, in boardrooms and drafting studios, rivals watched with a mixture of shock and grudging admiration. Van Allen had done it. Chrysler had done it. The gamble had paid off. At 1,046 feet from sidewalk to spire tip, the Chrysler building now stood taller than any structure humanity had ever built. It surpassed the Manhattan Company building by over 100 feet, rendering Severance's victory celebration premature and hollow. It eclipsed the Eiffel Tower in Paris, the previous record holder, by more than 40 feet. And it claimed a title that seemed, in that moment, permanent and unassailable. The raising of the Spire required approximately 80 workers directly involved in the operation, with another 100 standing by for support. The total weight lifted, including the spire sections and the rigging equipment, reached 32 tons. Yet the final bolt securing the tip to the crown was tightened at 11 o'clock in the morning, marking the official completion of the tallest building on Earth. The cost of the entire tower, including land acquisition, construction, materials, and labor, totaled approximately $15 million, though Chrysler never disclosed the exact figure. The building contained 3,900,000 bricks, 3,800 windows, and enough steel to build a railroad track from New York to Baltimore. The emotional peak of the moment was undeniable. This was triumph in its purest form, ambition realized, ego vindicated. Chrysler stood at the base of his tower and looked upward at the silver crown gleaming against the October sky. Van Allen stood beside him, exhausted and exhilarated, knowing that he had delivered the impossible. The workers who had assembled the Spire in secret allowed themselves brief smiles, aware that they had been part of something historic. And for 90 minutes, the world paused to acknowledge what had been accomplished. But triumph, as any student of history knows, is always temporary. And in October 1929, temporariness was about to be measured in days, not decades. The stock market, which had fueled the real estate boom and financed the skyline's vertical ambitions, was beginning to crack. Small tremors had appeared in the trading floors, in subtle signs that the decade-long party was ending. Investors were nervous, banks were cautious, and the optimism that had driven men to build towers 1,000 feet tall was giving way to something darker and more uncertain. The Chrysler Building stood at the intersection of triumph and catastrophe, the tallest structure on Earth rising into a sky that was about to fall. Chapter 7. When the market fell from the sky. Only days after the celebration, the stock market crashed and the skyline's optimism shattered. October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday. The day the bottom fell out of the American economy and took the nation's confidence with it. The crash began with panic selling in the morning hours and accelerated into chaos by midday. Fortunes evaporated in minutes. Millionaires became debtors before lunch. And across Manhattan, the towers that had symbolized prosperity and progress suddenly stood as monuments to hubris and excess. The Chrysler Building, still unfinished inside despite its completed exterior, was immediately caught in the economic wreckage. The logic that had justified its construction, the assumption that demand for office space would rise indefinitely, collapsed as thoroughly as the stock prices. Companies that had planned to lease entire floors canceled their contracts. Businesses that had seemed invincible began laying off workers and shuttering divisions. And the real estate market, which had climbed to dizzying heights on speculation and borrowed money, plummeted with a speed that made the tower's 4 floors per week seem glacial. Chrysler himself weathered the initial crash better than most. His automobile company, while affected by the downturn, remained operational. His personal wealth, though diminished, was still substantial. But the building that bore his name and housed his legacy became a financial albatross almost immediately. The tower had been designed to generate revenue through rents, to pay for itself over time while providing his children with a steady income. That plan depended on a thriving economy and a robust market for office space. Neither existed anymore. By 1930, the building's vacancy rate hovered near 30%. Entire floors stood empty, their windows dark, their hallways silent. The luxury of height, which had been sold as a premium amenity, now felt like a liability. Companies preferred ground floor locations where customers could walk in easily. Executives who had once demanded corner offices on the 50th floor now questioned the expense of elevator rides and heating costs. The building's operating expenses, which included maintenance, utilities, security, and staff salaries, ran approximately $1 million per year. Rental income, in the best months, barely covered half of that. The numbers told a story of desperation. The building could accommodate approximately 8,000 workers across its usable floors, but by 1931, occupancy had fallen to fewer than 4,000. Rental rates, which had been projected at $5 per square foot annually, dropped to less than $3 as landlords competed for the shrinking pool of tenants. The building's debt, financed through bonds and personal loans Chrysler had taken against his own assets, required annual interest payments of approximately $600,000. Revenue fell short month after month, forcing Chrysler to cover the gap from his own pocket. The emotional question that haunted every empty corridor was simple and devastating. What is the value of the tallest tower in a collapsing economy? The answer seemed to be nothing. Height without tenants was just expensive air. Architecture without income was just expensive art. And a legacy built on ambition was just expensive regret. The building began to take on a different character in the public imagination. Where it had once symbolized success and modernity, it now represented the excesses of the 20s and the folly of unchecked ambition. Newspaper editorials pointed to it as evidence of the speculative bubble that had burst so spectacularly. Political cartoons depicted it as a monument to greed, and ordinary New Yorkers, struggling through unemployment and breadlines, looked up at its gleaming crown and felt a mixture of awe and resentment. Chrysler, who had imagined the tower as a gift to his children, now faced the possibility that it would become a burden instead. The man who had built an automobile empire through calculated risks was learning that not all gambles pay off. And the architect who had designed the tallest building on Earth was discovering that records are meant to be broken. The question was no longer whether the Chrysler building was the tallest. The question was whether it would survive. Chapter 8: The Tallest Tower. No one needed. By 1931, another rival rose higher, and the Empire State Building stole the crown. The title of world's tallest building, which had seemed so permanent when the Spire was raised in October 1929, lasted less than 2 years. Construction on the Empire State Building, located just a few blocks west on Fifth Avenue, had begun in March 1930 with a speed and scale that dwarfed even the Chrysler project. Backed by deep-pocketed investors and designed with ruthless efficiency, the Empire State climbed at a pace of 4.5 floors per week, outpacing Chrysler's already aggressive schedule. And when it topped out in May 1931 at 1,250 feet, the Chrysler Building's reign was over. The defeat was both public and permanent. The Empire State Building did not just surpass the Chrysler Tower. It dominated it, adding 200 extra feet of height and claiming a psychological victory that no amount of architectural beauty could overcome. The press covered the new champion with the same breathless enthusiasm they had once reserved for Chrysler's Spire. The public flocked to the observation deck, and the world moved on, relegating the Chrysler building to second place and second thoughts. For Chrysler, the loss of the height record compounded the financial struggles already threatening to drown the building. The tower had been marketed as the tallest, a distinction that justified premium rents and attracted prestige tenants. Without that claim, it became just another skyscraper in a city full of them. Vacancy rates, already troubling, worsened. Companies that had considered leasing space now looked elsewhere. And the building's operating deficit deepened month by month. By 1932, Chrysler was forced to confront a reality he had never anticipated. The tower could not support itself. The rental income, even in the best scenarios, would not cover the operating costs and debt service. And his personal fortune, while still substantial, was not infinite. He began exploring options to sell the building or transfer ownership to a trust that could manage the financial burden. The negotiations were conducted quietly, behind closed doors, but rumors leaked into the press and the architectural community. The man who had financed the tallest building on Earth was trying to get rid of it. The building changed hands in 1933 and sold to a consortium of investors for approximately $2 million, a fraction of its construction cost. Chrysler retained some ownership stake, but relinquished operational control, a move that allowed him to distance himself from the financial disaster while preserving a symbolic connection to the tower. The sale was reported in the newspapers with a tone of inevitability, as if everyone had known all along that the project was doomed. But the new owners faced the same problems Chrysler had confronted. The depression showed no signs of ending. Office space remained abundant and cheap. And the Chrysler building, despite its beauty and its fame, could not attract enough tenants to justify its existence. Entire floors were left dark to save on electricity. Maintenance was deferred, staff was reduced, and the building entered a long period of decline that would last for decades. The tower's identity shifted during these years from triumphant champion to struggling survivor. It became a symbol not of what was possible, but of what had gone wrong. The Art Deco ornament, which had seemed so modern and exciting in 1929, began to feel dated as architectural tastes moved towards sleeker, more minimalist designs. The stainless steel crown, which had gleamed with such confidence, now caught the light like a reminder of better days. And the building itself, and still magnificent, but no longer dominant, stood as a monument to ambition that had overreached. Rumors circulated through the real estate community about financial desperation and boardroom battles. Some investors wanted to strip the building of its ornamental details and rent them as scrap metal. Others proposed converting the upper floors into residential apartments, a scheme that never gained traction, and a few suggested demolishing the tower entirely and replacing it with something more profitable, a plan that was discussed seriously before being abandoned as impractical. The building survived these threats not because it was financially viable, but because it was too expensive to tear down. Demolition costs would have exceeded any potential gain from the land. And so, the tower stood, empty and struggling, waiting for a future that seemed unlikely to arrive. The question that haunted those years was simple. How does a monument to success survive its own failure? The answer would take decades to reveal itself and would require a fundamental shift in how the city understood its own history. Chapter 9: Survival Behind the Silver Crown. Through war, recession, and shifting corporate empires, the tower refused to disappear. The middle decades of the 20th century were not kind to Art Deco architecture. The style that had defined the 20s and early 30s, with its geometric patterns, lavish materials, and celebration of the machine age, fell out of favor as tastes shifted toward the stark simplicity of international modernism. Glass boxes rose along Park Avenue. Steel and concrete towers replaced ornate limestone facades. And buildings like the Chrysler, with their decorative flourishes and historical references, were dismissed as relics of a naive and excessive era. The building changed ownership several times during this period, each transaction reflecting a mix of optimism and desperation. Real estate investors bought it hoping to turn a profit through improved management or higher rents. Corporations acquired it as a trophy asset, a symbol of corporate prestige that looked impressive in annual reports, even if it bled money. And speculators held it briefly before selling to the next buyer, in each one convinced they could succeed where the previous owner had failed. By the 1950s, the Chrysler Building's condition had deteriorated noticeably. The stainless steel crown, though structurally sound, had lost some of its luster. The lobby, with its elaborate murals and Art Deco detailing, showed signs of neglect. The elevators, once the fastest in the world, groaned and stuttered. And the upper floors, many of them still vacant, developed leaks and drafts that made them barely habitable. The building was not quite abandoned, but it was no longer loved. The financial picture remained bleak. Operating costs continued to exceed revenue by significant margins. Annual maintenance expenses reached approximately $700,000 by the early 60s, while rental income struggled to surpass $500,000. Deferred maintenance accumulated like compound interest. The facade needed cleaning. The mechanical systems needed updating. The interior spaces needed renovation. But each improvement required capital that no owner was willing or able to invest. Ownership transferred to real estate developer Saul Goldman and investor Alex DiLorenzo in 1961 for approximately $4 million, a price that reflected the building's troubled history and uncertain future. The new owners stabilized the finances somewhat through aggressive cost-cutting and selective renovations, but the fundamental problem remained. The Chrysler Building was expensive to maintain and difficult to fill, a combination that made long-term profitability nearly impossible. The 1970s brought a different kind of crisis. New York City itself was collapsing under the weight of fiscal mismanagement, white flight, and rising crime. The municipal government teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned, and the real estate market, already depressed, entered a free fall that made the Great Depression seem mild by comparison. Buildings across Manhattan stood empty. Landlords walked away from properties rather than pay the taxes. And the skyline, once a symbol of American confidence, became a monument to urban decay. But something unexpected happened during these dark years. Preservationists began to recognize the value of what was being lost. The Art Deco buildings that had been dismissed as outdated were suddenly seen as irreplaceable pieces of architectural history. The ornamental details that had been mocked as excessive were now appreciated as craftsmanship of a quality that modern construction could not replicate. And the Chrysler Building, despite its struggles, was recognized as one of the finest examples of its era. The tower was designated a New York City landmark in 1978, a status that protected it from demolition or significant alteration. The designation carried both benefits and burdens. The building could not be torn down, which ensured its survival. But it also could not be modified without approval from the Landmarks Preservation Commission, which limited the owner's options for renovation. The balance between preservation and practicality would define the building's future for decades to come. The cost of restoring the Chrysler building to its original condition was estimated at approximately $12 million in 1978, a sum that seemed impossibly large given the building's financial struggles. The stainless steel crown alone required over $1 million in cleaning and repair. The lobby murals, painted by Edward Trumbull and depicting transportation and industry, needed careful restoration by specialists. And the mechanical systems, some of them dating to the original construction, needed complete replacement. But the landmark designation also brought renewed interest from investors and the public. The building began to be seen not as a financial liability, but as a cultural asset. Tourism increased as visitors sought out the lobby and the architectural details. Tenants willing to pay premium rents for the prestige of a Chrysler building address began to return. And slowly, painfully, the economics began to stabilize. The question that had haunted the building for decades, whether it could survive its own past, was finally being answered. Yes, it could survive. But survival would require something more than money. It would require a city willing to remember why the building had mattered in the first place. Chapter 10. A monument reclaimed by time. Decades after its reckless birth, the building became the very image of New York itself. The transformation did not happen overnight. It required patient investment, careful restoration, and a cultural shift in how New York understood its own history. But by the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Chrysler building had been reclaimed from obscurity and elevated to icon status. It appeared on postcards and posters. It was featured in films and television shows. And it became, for many people around the world, the single most recognizable symbol of Manhattan's skyline. The stainless steel crown, cleaned and polished until it gleamed like molten silver, caught the light at dawn and dusk in ways that made photographers weep with joy. The triangular windows that punctured the arched terraces created patterns of light and shadow that changed throughout the day, and the building's silhouette, distinctive and elegant, became as essential to the city's identity as the Statue of Liberty or Central Park. The restoration work focused on returning the building to its 1929 grandeur while updating the infrastructure for modern use. The exterior stainless steel was carefully cleaned using specialized techniques that removed decades of grime without damaging the metal. The process required scaffolding that wrapped around the crown like a cocoon, and workers who understood the delicate balance between aggressive cleaning and preservation. The final result was spectacular, revealing the original luster that had made the building famous. Inside, the lobby received equally meticulous attention. The walls, covered in red Moroccan marble, were cleaned and polished until they glowed. The ceiling mural, painted by Edward Trumbull in 1929, depicted transportation and energy in bold Art Deco style, with images of airplanes, automobiles, and the Chrysler building itself. The mural had faded over decades of exposure to light and air, but restoration specialists painstakingly matched the original colors and repaired damaged sections. The elevator doors, made of intricate inlaid wood in geometric patterns, were refinished to highlight the craftsmanship that had gone into their creation. The mechanical systems, less visible but equally important, were completely replaced. The original elevators, though fast for their time, were slow by modern standards and prone to breakdowns. New elevators were installed using the original shafts, providing speed and reliability while preserving the building's structural integrity. Heating, cooling, and ventilation systems were upgraded to meet contemporary standards without compromising the historic character of the spaces. And the electrical systems, some of them dating to the 1920s, were rewired to handle the demands of computers, telecommunications, and modern office equipment. The building's renaissance was not just architectural, it was cultural. Magazine articles celebrated its return to prominence. Architecture critics praised the restoration as a model of how historic buildings could be preserved without becoming museums. And tenants began to see the Chrysler Building address as a mark of distinction, a signal that their company valued history and quality. Rental rates climbed, vacancy rates dropped, and the building that had struggled for decades finally achieved financial stability. But the transformation also brought renewed scrutiny of the building's history. Journalists and historians began digging into the archives, uncovering details about the construction that had been forgotten or suppressed. The story of the secret spire became legend. The rivalry with the Manhattan Company building became a parable about ambition and competition. And the human cost, the workers who had risked and sometimes lost their lives, became part of the narrative that made the building more than just beautiful architecture. The question that emerged from this period was more subtle than the ones that had come before. What does it mean to celebrate a building whose creation involves such risk and sacrifice? The answer, as with most historical questions, was complicated. The Chrysler Building could be both a masterpiece and a monument to hubris. It could inspire awe and demand accountability, and it could stand as proof that beauty and cost are not mutually exclusive, but eternally intertwined. Chapter 11. The Secrets That Still Echo. Late-night security guards still speak of footsteps on empty floors and drafts that whisper through the crown. The paranormal reputation of the Chrysler Building has grown steadily over the decades, fed by stories passed from one security shift to the next, from maintenance workers to janitorial staff, from tenants who stayed late to visitors who felt something they could not quite name. The tales are remarkably consistent across generations: footsteps in empty hallways, shadows that move without a source, voices that murmur just below the threshold of comprehension, and always, always, the sense of being watched from somewhere higher up. The upper floors, particularly those near the crown, attract the most stories. Security guards report hearing metallic clanging sounds late at night, as if someone were working with tools on the steel structure. The sounds echo through the elevator shafts and stairwells, loud enough to investigate, but gone by the time anyone arrives. Other guards describe cold spots near the windows of the 65th floor, sudden drops in temperature that persist for minutes before dissipating without explanation. And a few, only a few, claim to have seen figures moving near the arched terraces of the crown, silhouettes visible for a moment before vanishing into the darkness. The stories are compelling. They tap into our desire for mystery, for evidence that the past is not truly past, for proof that the men who built the tower left something more than steel and stone behind. But the rational explanations are equally compelling for those willing to examine them. The Chrysler Building, like all tall structures, is a vertical wind tunnel. The arched terraces of the crown create turbulence as air flows around and through the building. This turbulence generates low-frequency sounds that the human ear interprets as footsteps or voices, especially in quiet environments where background noise is minimal. The phenomenon is well documented in architectural acoustics, and the Chrysler crown, with its combination of open arches and metal surfaces, is particularly susceptible. The cold spots near the windows are caused by temperature differentials between the heated interior and the cold exterior. The building's windows, while sealed, are not perfectly insulated. Cold air seeps in through microscopic gaps, creating localized zones where the temperature can drop 10 or 15 degrees. On winter nights, when the exterior temperature falls below freezing, these cold zones can feel dramatic enough to seem supernatural. And the shadows? Light refraction through stainless steel creates optical illusions, especially at dawn and dusk when the sun strikes the crown at oblique angles. The triangular windows act as prisms, bending light in ways that can produce shapes and patterns on interior walls. Combine this with the natural tendency of the human brain to find faces and figures in random patterns, and the recipe for ghost sightings is complete. But understanding the science does not completely erase the mystery. The building's structural engineering incorporates tolerances for wind, temperature, and seismic activity that allow it to move and flex in response to external forces. At the top of the crown, during strong winds, the building can sway up to 6 inches from its vertical axis. This movement is imperceptible to people on lower floors, but becomes noticeable near the crown, where the displacement is greatest. The sensation of the building breathing, of the structure living and responding, is not paranormal, but it is profoundly unnerving. The tower can withstand wind loads of approximately 120 pounds per square foot on its exposed surfaces, a figure calculated based on the maximum recorded wind speeds in Manhattan. The stainless steel crown, despite its delicate appearance, is anchored to the structural steel with bolts capable of bearing thousands of pounds of stress. The entire assembly is designed to flex without failing, to absorb energy without breaking. And in storms, when the wind howls through the arched terraces and the building sways with the force, the crown performs exactly as intended. But the sounds it makes in those moments, the groans and creaks and metallic whispers, are enough to convince anyone listening that something more than physics is at work. The question of whether the Chrysler building is haunted is, in the end, less interesting than the question of why people need it to be haunted. The paranormal stories serve a purpose beyond entertainment. They acknowledge that something momentous happened here. They honor, in their own way, the risks taken and the sacrifices made. And they transform the building from a piece of real estate into a living entity with memory and presence. The truth, as always, is more complex than either complete belief or complete skepticism allows. The Chrysler building is not haunted by ghosts, but it is haunted by history. And history, unlike ghosts, is always real. Chapter 12: Steel, Ego, and the Cost of Height. In the end, the Chrysler building stands as proof that beauty can be born from rivalry and yet never escape its cost. The story began with a secret spire rising through a hollow crown in October 1929, a gamble engineered through deception and speed. It continued through economic collapse, ownership changes, decades of neglect, and eventual resurrection as a cultural icon. And it arrives here. And nearly a century later, with the building still standing, still gleaming, still asking questions about ambition and consequence. Walter Chrysler wanted immortality. He got it, but not in the form he imagined. His name is carved into the skyline, yes, but it is carved in a building that bankrupted him, outlasted his control, and became famous as much for its struggles as for its triumphs. The man who built an automobile empire through calculated risk learned that buildings are not cars. They cannot be mass-produced or easily sold. They cannot be recalled if they fail. They stand where they are built, immovable and demanding, requiring care and capital long after their creators are gone. William Van Allen wanted vindication. He got it for exactly 90 minutes, the time it took to raise the spire and claim the world record. Then he got obscurity. His rivalry with H. Craig Severance is remembered by architecture historians but forgotten by the public. His masterpiece became someone else's property, someone else's problem, someone else's glory. The architect who designed the most recognizable building in New York died nearly broke and largely forgotten, his genius acknowledged only after his death. And the workers who built the tower? Their names are lost. Their faces are absent from the photographs. Their stories were not recorded in the official histories. But their labor is embedded in every rivet, every beam, every floor that climbs toward the silver crown. They walked narrow beams without harnesses. They riveted steel in winter wind. They hoisted tons of material through impossible spaces. And they did it for wages that barely supported their families, under conditions that accepted injury and death as inevitable. The official record claims 0 fatalities during construction, a claim that seems statistically miraculous given the pace and the risk. But official records in that era were incomplete by design. Men who died were buried and forgotten. Men who were injured were paid off and dismissed. And the myth of the accident-free skyscraper, so valuable for public relations and insurance premiums, was carefully maintained by those who had the most to gain from it. The paranormal stories that haunt the building serve a purpose beyond entertainment. They insist that something momentous happened here. They honor, however imperfectly, the men whose risks made the tower possible. And they transform the Chrysler building from a piece of real estate into a monument with memory and consequence. But we do not need ghosts to understand the cost of the Chrysler building. We only need to look at the numbers. $15 million to construct in an era when that sum could have fed a small city. 27 tons of steel lifted in 90 minutes through a gamble that could have killed dozens. Eat 4 floors per week at a pace that left no room for safety or second thoughts. And decades of financial struggle that turned a monument to success into a monument to hubris. The modern skyline of New York owes everything to buildings like the Chrysler. They proved that height was possible. They established the engineering techniques that would define urban architecture for the next century. And they created the cultural expectation that cities should reach upward. That ambition should be measured in feet and floors, that the human desire to dominate the horizon is both natural and inevitable. But we inherit not just the beauty, but the logic that created it, the belief that speed justifies risk, the assumption that workers are expendable in pursuit of greatness, the conviction that private ambition, however ruthless, serves the public good. These ideas are embedded in the steel frame as surely as the rivets that hold it together. When we look at the Chrysler building today, gleaming against the sunset with its silver crown catching the last light of day, what are we seeing? Are we celebrating genius or forgetting the price paid to lift it there? Are we admiring architecture or ignoring the men who balanced on beams hundreds of feet above the pavement with nothing to catch them if they fell? Are we honoring ambition or excusing the ruthlessness required to achieve it? The answer is all of these things, tangled together in ways that cannot be separated. The Chrysler Building is beautiful. It is also evidence. It is a masterpiece. It is also a monument to risk and sacrifice that the official histories chose to obscure. It stands as proof that human beings can accomplish the impossible, and it stands as a reminder that the impossible always has a cost, paid by those with the least power to refuse. The question that lingers is not whether the Chrysler Building should have been built. It exists. It matters. It will outlive all of us. The question is whether we are willing to see it clearly, to acknowledge both its glory and its shadows, to celebrate the achievement without erasing the struggle. In the end, the Chrysler Building is exactly what it has always been: ambition carved in steel, reaching toward the sky with one hand while the other clutches the bill. And we, standing below, looking up, must decide whether that is something to admire or something to learn from. Perhaps it is both.